All right, Donald Kendall here again with another Stopping Socialism video, joined as always by Justin Haskins. So today we're going to be talking about what I think is kind of like the core message of what we want to get across with the Stopping Socialism project, which is what is it going to be in the future? Like what is the actual plot of the socialists for America 2020, right? So the one kind of main point that I always try to bring up when I'm talking about this, whether it's in radio interviews or just with friends and family, is that socialism manifests differently throughout different periods of time, right? So, of course, Bernie Sanders isn't trying to go take us back to the Soviet Union style socialism that, people think that's what we're trying to say he's doing. It's a totally different type of government control and top-down mandates by the government. So, like I said, socialism back in the Soviet Union days, I mean, that is pretty much straight up government controlling and operating the means of operation, right? The means of production. Fast forward to Sweden, let's say, in the 70s and the 80s, they tried to backdoor socialism through a thing called wage earners funds, where they were basically taking profits from companies, putting it into these wage earners funds. That was basically a way of transferring private ownership of companies back to a publicly or collectively owned ownership of these companies. So, and again, it's just kind of a different means to the same ends. And then what is going to happen, or what we think the plan is for socialism in the current day, is even more different and I think sinister than any of those. Justin, am I off base on any of this yet?
Nope. I think you got it right. I think initially when socialism started to become really popular, with people like Karl Marx and Frederick Engels and other people writing, Communist Manifesto and other things, and socialist movements really started taking off in the 1900s. I mean, the 1800s, and then the early 1900s. I think the idea was it was centered very much around workers and factories and that whole setting and how unfair that was. And wouldn't it just be better if the workers owned the factories and owned all of these various farms and means of production and all of that stuff? And so it was very focused on confiscating property, because there's really no other way to do that other than in that time period than actually taking the factories and the machinery in the factories and all of that away from the people who owned it and giving it to the people who were working in the factories. That's sort of how socialism initially came about. But then over time, what happened is a variety of different changes occurred in the marketplace, and there were all sorts of economic changes, technological changes, and the world really became a very different place than the one that Karl Marx lived in. And so socialism tried to manifest itself in a lot of different ways, especially after so many people were murdered by socialist regimes in the first half of the 20th century, and even into the second half of the 20th century, where you had the Soviet Union, you had China and other places. And that's when you started seeing wage earners funds and those kinds of things pop up as a way to sort of put a smiley face on socialism, figure out a nice way of confiscating property, because the old way of confiscating property was just too bloody for most people to deal with. So that those things still happened, of course, in Nicaragua and in South America, Central America, other parts of the world. They were still having bloody revolutions in Africa and elsewhere with socialist governments, but they were trying to find a nicer way of doing it. And now I think the nice way of doing it is modern monetary theory.
And there it is. Modern monetary theory. That has been our theory, I guess, from basically the start of our project here, Stopping Socialism. We thought that this is the way that they're going to approach kind of 21st century socialism and like the current day, is through this system of modern monetary theory. And if we're correct, you're going to start hearing more and more about it. And we've been talking about this, and it has been coming up more and more. So I really do think we're correct. And the biggest part of why I believe it is, I'll tell you what it is in a minute for those that haven't been following us as closely, is that it's the path of least resistance. And to me, that is the most important part about this whole scheme. So what is modern monetary theory? So basically, to kind of boil it down, modern monetary theorists believe, rightfully, that the United States has a monopoly on the production of the US dollar itself, right? So because we can just run the printing presses, we will never run the risk of defaulting. We could always print more money. So that risk of defaulting is non-existent in their perspective. So the idea of being worried about the debt or the deficits is largely an exacerbated concern. Again, this is their perspective, not mine. Now, their caveat here, or the thing that you do have to worry about, you run the risk of inflation. And I think that people that have any grasp on the monetary system or was thinking that as soon as I started saying running the printing presses. But the modern monetary theorists have different ways of dealing with inflation, which is, again, they're kind of their number one concern if we were to run full bore into this idea. So I can get into some of the quotes, but the biggest backer of this idea is a lady named Stephanie Kelton, a professional named Stephanie Kelton, who was the senior economic advisor to the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign. And correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, is she also the senior economic advisor to his current 2020 campaign?
Yes, she sure is. And she was she was the senior economist for the Democrats on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee in 2015. And she was brought into that role by Bernie Sanders as well.
Exactly. So under like our current system, the government is able to kind of control just monetary policy just by kind of raising and lowering the interest rate, right? That's their kind of main lever of kind of shifting, monetary policy, right? So Stephanie Kelton, in an interview done with CNBC, she kind of explained kind of how far-reaching this idea of modern monetary theory is, where she talks about how if we were experiencing inflation from printing all of this money and not worrying about the debt and deficits, we'd have to figure out what is driving inflation. What's the source of inflationary pressure? She says you might see increases in headline inflation rates because the housing component or healthcare, energy is more likely. These tend to be more important drivers of inflation. And so when you think about how to fight inflation, I think the first question is to understand what the source of the inflationary pressure is, and then to move forward with a policy tool that you think is going to help basically get that inflation under control. If you've got inflation resulting from energy price increases, it's probably not going to do much to have the Fed raise interest rates or to even have Congress raise taxes. You've got to find something else that's going to work. So essentially, she's trading out that one lever. A modern monetary theory is trading out that one lever of raising and lowering the interest rate with a whole council of different knobs and pulleys and buttons and switches to be able to control the entire economy just in general. I mean, Justin, am I going too far here, or is that generally the argument?
Yeah, that's exactly what they're arguing for. I think the important thing to understand is that modern monetary theorists believe that those tools that Donald was just talking about, that those tools are essential. They're not something that you theoretically could have. They're necessary tools. You have to be able to control the economy somehow, because if you get inflation, you need to be able to deal with that inflation. And you don't want to deal with that inflation by raising interest rates. They don't like raising interest rates. They want to keep interest rates to zero or close to zero. So they don't want to raise interest rates. That's a normal way that you would deal with this. So you have to deal with it some other way. So they would say price controls, regulations, let's destroy this industry over here and favor this industry over there. And then you might be thinking, well, what good are taxes? What's the point of taxes? Who cares about taxes in a system like this? Well, they do use taxes to raise revenue, but that's not the primary reason for taxes under their system. The primary reason for taxes, according to modern monetary theory, is to punish businesses and industries you don't like. That's the primary point. Now, just let's stop for a second and think this through. Let's just think about the key components of this. Debt doesn't matter. Deficits don't matter. Government controls the economy. Government punishes businesses and industries it doesn't like with taxes. Does this sound familiar? This sounds an awful lot like the socialist dream, right? Like this is exactly what socialists would love to have, and explains why Bernie Sanders loves Stephanie Kelton's theories so much, why he's so close to her on all of these different parts of his career in the last 5 years. Why? Because if this is true, this gives Bernie Sanders everything he could ever want without, and this is the key, without actually confiscating anyone's property. That's the whole point. You don't have to confiscate, other than money, with the bad industries that you don't like, taking their money from them and destroying their businesses. Other than that, you don't actually have to confiscate factory XYZ anymore. All you have to do is print a bunch of money and give it to this other factory that you like more than this one, right? Yeah. And so you pick the winners. It's, picking winners and losers. You hear that all the time. This whole system is based on picking winners and losers. That's the whole system. And so it's socialism without confiscating property.
Yeah, and the thing that really kind of like crystallized this, at least for me, probably both of us, but really crystallized this for me was when like the Green New Deal was kind of the big headline news for those, I don't know, a couple of months, I guess. And it was just like, the numbers would come out and it would be like, to get everything underneath the Green New Deal wish list, it was going to take $90 trillion over 10 years.
On the high end, but yes.
And it was like, how would you possibly pay for all of this? And it's like, well, when you factor in modern monetary theory and you don't have to pay for any of it, boom, it just completely made sense to me.
And this is why it's so important to understand this. See, modern monetary theory is the missing puzzle piece to everything Bernie Sanders says that makes no sense. Because you hear Bernie Sanders, he gets asked all the time. He did an interview not that long ago, a sit-down interview with someone. I can't remember who it was. Was
60 minutes.
60 minutes. And they asked him, how do you plan to pay for all of this? And he says, well, we rolled out this plan and we've got all these taxes. And it's like, yeah, but even on your own website, when we add up all these numbers, it's not even half of what you're saying it's going to cost. Never mind other people. So where do you get the rest of it? And he didn't have an answer.
Right.
Why? Because he can't tell you the truth. The truth is he just plans on printing the money because he doesn't think it matters. But he's not going to say that because it's such a radical idea. He knows he can't say it. So he invents ideas like taxes and stuff. And he says, well, I'll just pay for it by taxing the rich and making them pay their fair share. Let me be very clear. There is not enough money in the world owned by millionaires and billionaires to pay for all of Bernie Sanders' programs. You could confiscate every penny from every billionaire on the planet, not just in America, but on the whole planet, and you couldn't pay for everything in the Green New Deal. Yeah. So where is he going to get the money?
Yeah, so we have probably read up on modern monetary theory more than most people, right? So there are like really kind of sinister stuff when you kind of look into all of this. So basically, when you're having the government pay stuff, buy stuff, that is crowding out the private sector. So you're basically trading in private sector produced goods and services with things that the government would pay for. So just on its face, you're kind of seeing the gradual shift towards just straight up government control. There's other really kind of wild stuff, which is basically there are some people that kind of admit that, yes, under this system, we would not need taxes for revenue generation. We just don't need it. So there are some advocates of modern monetary theory that say that we would still have a level of taxes, even at baseline, just for everybody, not just for punitive purposes, because, Justin, you mentioned that, and that is the case, but just baseline to enforce that people still use the US dollar. If you have a tax bill that you have to pay in US dollar, you can't shift to some type of cryptocurrency or something to get away from the inflation that will inevitably come with this. So just that kind of control is already factored in with some of these academics that are behind modern monetary theory. And then my absolute favorite quote is from L. Randall Wray, who's a big advocate. In fact, I believe he spoke on behalf of modern monetary theory in front of a congressional committee. He's a professor from, I forget which college. Justin, you might know off the top of your head.
I can't remember. It seems like they're all from Bard or Stony Brook. I think Stephanie Kelton is from Stony Brook. She's from Bard, maybe.
I think you're right. So he says, I do like high taxes on high income and high wealth. I have argued that they should be set so high as to be confiscatory, not at a marginal income tax rate of 70%, but at 99% or even 125% or 1,000%. Take it all, he says. I am not confident that the effective tax rate will ever be that high due to exemptions the rich will write into the code, but but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't aspire for better. And because you've got too much income, too much wealth, too much power, what will we do with that tax revenue? Uncle Sam doesn't need your money. We'll burn it.
Burn it.
They'll burn it.
What does it matter? What does it matter? If all you're doing is just printing the money then it doesn't matter. The money is it's essentially meaningless. We just take the money from the people we don't like or for whatever reason, and then we burn it. Who cares? Just print the money we want, send it where we want to send it.
One of the kind of the craziest things is that proponents of the modern monetary theory, they'll point to Japan as being the shining example of what a government could do if they stop caring about what the debt and deficits are. When Justin and I, we looked kind of underneath the hood of Japan and saw exactly what we expected to see, is that they have a very stagnant GDP, and part of the GDP is government spending. That proportion of how much the government spending makes of the GDP has increased. So when I was talking about that gradual shift from private to public, you were seeing it firsthand in Japan.
Right. And the reason why Japan is important is because if you talk to a person who likes modern monetary theory, what they'll tell you is, because normally the conservative reaction to modern monetary theory is, oh, so we're just going to print all this money, inflation, hyperinflation. And so what they love to talk about Japan, because Japan's been printing tons and tons and tons of money, and yet they don't have hyperinflation. So they love to point to Japan as the example. Now, why don't they have hyperinflation? That's like a whole other thing that we would have to do like a completely separate video on. There's all sorts of theories for why that's the case. But the important thing to understand is this: Japan has had essentially no GDP growth, zero GDP growth in more than 2 decades.
Yeah.
None, zero. Think about that from an American perspective. When we have 0% GDP growth, it's called it's a huge recession. It's a gigantic problem. Okay. If you had 0 GDP growth for 5, 6, 7 years, that would be considered like the worst thing that's ever happened since the Great Depression. That's what they would say. Even when you had Barack Obama and all the things that happened in 2008, we didn't have 0 GDP growth for 6, 7, 8 years. We didn't have that. So can you imagine for 20 years? Can you imagine for 25 years? That's what they have in Japan, because the government essentially runs everything and the government sucks at running things.
Right.
So you end up with very poor economic production.
Yeah. So the other thing that I kind of want to mention is, again, this just kind of like the path of least resistance, because let's say Bernie Sanders and he comes into office, he appoints Stephanie Kelton for some high up role. It's not like they have to pass legislation to do this. They just have to convince enough people to not care about the debt and deficits. So, yeah, I think that we believe this is the path forward.
Well,
21st century socialism.
Right. And I think that modern monetary theory is already happening.
Yeah.
Right. It's already happening. We're already doing modern monetary theory. Exactly. To keep this in mind, the ranking member of the U.S. Senate Budget Committee has been Bernie Sanders throughout this whole period of time. He's the ranking member of the minority party in the Senate for the past several years. He's been the ranking member. And who has his primary economist been? It's been Stephanie Kelton, the big main proponent of modern monetary theory. So the Democrats are already operating under this system. They're just not talking about it. They're not saying it, but they're already operating under this idea. So we're seeing this happen. We're already seeing modern monetary theory in existence. They do have to pass legislation to take it to the next level.
Oh, sure.
Right. But the reality is they're already doing this, because you have these massive programs that don't go away, like Medicare and Medicaid and all these other Social Security. Sure. They don't go away. And so automatically the spending keeps going up. Automatically they pass these budget things because they don't want the government to shut down. And so they are like keeping it alive by passing bills and whatever. But the point that you're making is exactly right. Ultimately, you don't need to have some big grand like Obamacare piece of legislation that says we're going to have modern monetary theory.
Right.
They will never even use those words, I bet. What they will say, all they have to do is say the XYZ crisis is too important to worry about the debt. Or we need to, like climate change is a perfect example, right? Where it's an existential threat to human civilization. And you're worried about, a penny pinching? Give me a break. We're all about to die if we don't do something about climate change. So you're worried about printing money? We've been printing money. There's no hyperinflation. It's all a myth. You can see how this would play out in a political conversation and how appealing it would be to the average guy walking down the street who says, well, yeah, we've had these big debts and deficits forever. and everything seems okay.
Yeah,
right.
And it's just kind of proven by Bernie Sanders' rhetoric, like how easy is it for him to come up with new spending programs, and how difficult is it to pull the "how are you going to pay for it" response out of him? I mean, come on.
He has not had an answer to that question of how he's going to pay for it in his, like, literally since he started running for president in 2015 for the 2016 election. He's never had an answer to that question. And although it's been asked to him, he just brushes it off, scoffs at it, and moves on to the next question. And the mainstream press will continuously find a way to ignore that he's not answering that question or to give him a pass. And he never actually has to answer the question. He should be disqualified for not even coming up with some way, a fake way of paying for things. Yeah. And yet he's not. We treat him like he's a serious candidate. And it's not hard to imagine how Americans might adopt this without even knowing that they're adopting it.
Exactly. And that is why we are here and why we are trying to stop socialism. If you want to join us in this crusade to stop socialism, go to stoppingsocialism.com. Plenty of resources on there. Follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/stoppingsocialism. You can find us on YouTube as well. We have a channel on there. Instagram account as well. Justin, any last words you want to say before we sign off for this episode?
Debts and deficits do in fact matter.
They do.
They matter.
All right. Thank you all. We'll talk to you next time.